Welcome to Enform's info session video on sampling and the audit process, Part 2. In Part 1, we talked about the basic concept behind sampling and interview sampling standards. Now, in Part 2, we will cover site sampling standards, documentation sampling standards, and correctly scoring your observations. Let's start with site sampling and establish the total number of active sites. In some cases, that is straightforward. In cases where you have workers moving from site to site over time, you can figure out the number of work sites by freezing time. If at any one moment in time this work crew can be at any one of 5 sites, that would only count as one work site, not 5. Site sampling standards work just like interview sampling in terms of how many of the total number of sites you need to visit. A 2-site company needs to have both sites visited. A company with 3 or 4 sites, at least 2 sites visited. 5 to 8 sites, at least 3. And 9 to 30 sites, at least 30%. However, just like the interview standard, there are more considerations than just the minimum number. If you are in multiple provinces or multiple WCB accounts or industry codes, you need sites that represent each of these. If the company work sites vary in terms of the number of workers at each, you'll need to capture both a larger work site or sites and smaller work sites in your audit. If one site is very different from the rest of the operation, that might also cause you to include it in the sample. And the standard says you must always include the main office or shop complex in the audit. You will also want to rotate which sites get visited from one audit to the next. In fact, for certification audits, if a company has multiple sites and you're only visiting a representative sample other than the main office or shop, you must mix it up from the last certification audit. In a 3-year cycle, you want all fixed sites to be included. You will also need to apply sampling principles to your review of company records. Between JSAs, SWPs, on-site or maybe daily hazard assessments, inspection records, maintenance records, and investigation files, there are usually hundreds, if not thousands, of possible records to look at. The same sampling principles apply. If you have 5 records on something you need to measure, you'll probably look at all 5. 1 record per month? Again, might look at all of them. But if you have 20 records of a given activity, possibly 12 or 15. If you have 100 records, looking at 25 is probably sufficient. What if you had 1,000 records? Double your review, and you'll likely be accurate in your assessment. As with interviews and site selection, you should be strategic. Suppose a company has 50 vehicles on which they're supposed to record daily inspections and monthly maintenance, and the records are stored by vehicle. To get a representative sample, you want to pick a reasonable number of vehicles to drill down on, say 16 to 20 of them. If they have 2 or 3 basic types of vehicles, you'd want to make sure your sample includes a proportionate amount of each. You obviously can't look at every daily inspection. You could pick a few days each month and look at these more closely to get a sample that will show you consistency over the course of a year. Or you could pick 2 specific months and apply this across all the vehicles. As for the monthly maintenance records, again, you'll probably look at some in more detail to see if they are typically filled out as required. If they are properly filled out, you'll likely just check to see if there are 12 monthly maintenance records for each of the sampled vehicles over the past year. That brings us to the percentage of positive indicators. If you looked at 20 of 50 vehicles and 5 of them are missing inspection and maintenance records, while 15 of them have all the necessary records, that represents 75% positive indicators. Your percentage of positive indicators is always based on the sample you work from. That's why you always want to record total number available to sample, your sample size, and the percentage of those documents that confirm the company was following its own procedures. That evidence is your positive indicators, and this is exactly what you'll need in your auditor notes later on to justify your score. If you find yourself uncertain as to a sample size when it comes to reviewing records, one tool you might want to use is the COR interview standard. If the interview standard for 50 employees is 19 interviews, chances are that if you have 50 records, looking at 19 of them will give you an accurate picture of the records as a whole. It does not always work perfectly, but it is a good place to start if sampling is not coming naturally to you. Now, the total number of samples is one issue. How you select the samples themselves is another matter. There are a number of sampling methods you can use when working with records. In these illustrations, the math is based on a random sampling. To randomly sample records, you can assign a numbering system to the documents and then use a random number table to draw out the required number of records. You can also go with an interval sampling, where you take the total number of records, divide by the number that you will look at, and then use that as your interval. So you might look at every third, or every fifth, or every 10th record. If there is a significant difference in risk between various categories, you may select more reports from higher risk categories than lower risk categories. This is a stratification sampling strategy. In some cases, you might consider a time block sampling approach, where you review documents from a specified period of time. This is often appropriate when a company does seasonal work or there are activity peaks during the year. And finally, let's talk about audit sampling during your on-site observation tours. Remember, audit observations are not inspections. In an audit observation tour, you are looking for verification of your documentation and interview findings. So, for example, in your documentation review, you will have recorded examples of engineering controls that were to have been implemented. Let's say guards on new equipment. Now, at the worksite, you want to see these guards are in place and functioning. Think of these as strategic observations, a way to prove out documentation and interview findings. That's the first order of business. However, in your observation tour, you will also encounter other recordable items such as poor housekeeping or improper storage of chemicals. Let's call these random observations, which may be included in the auditor's findings along with strategic observations. Audit observations are also different from inspections in terms of scoring method, as you are tracking both positive and negative evidence in what you're observing. Often, with a scored inspection, points are lost for each infraction or shortcoming. A worker not wearing his safety glasses, -1. A guard not secured in place, -5, and so on. In an audit, to score observations, you have to think in terms of opportunities to observe something. And this applies to both strategic and random observations. The opportunities are your sample size. So let's say you want to observe and score compliance with the company's directives on personal protective equipment, or PPE. During an observational site tour, you encounter 5 individuals who should have been wearing safety glasses, gloves, and steel-toed boots. Your sample size, or opportunities to observe PPE, is 5. Let's say 4 are fully compliant, but 1 worker is missing their safety glasses and gloves. If it was a scored inspection looking at PPE, you might dock a point for the glasses and another point for the gloves. But this is an audit observation. As such, you could count this as 5 opportunities to show compliance and only 4 do so, or 80% positive indicators. You could count each piece of PPE at 3 per worker times 5 workers, that's 15. Then you could minus 2 and say 13 of 15 pieces of required PPE were being worn. That would be technically accurate, although, as you can see, the math can get overly complex. What you could not do is say there are 5 workers and 2 missing bits of PPE, so it's 3 points out of 5, or 60%. You need to ask, how many opportunities were there to demonstrate something? And then, how many of those demonstrated positive compliance? If you always track the number of opportunities and the number of positive indicators, it will remove any question on how you arrived at your score, and it is the sort of material that makes for a solid auditor note. So to summarize, when you are auditing, knowing how sampling math works is essential to get accurate results without doing too much work. The smaller the total, the higher percentage you will sample. The larger the total, the lower the percentage you will sample. Use the COR interview standard as a guide if you need further help. The minimum sample size is written into the COR audit standards for both interviews and worksite observations. However, these are minimums, and keep in mind other factors that need to be considered. Are all company levels captured in your interview sample? Are all provinces, WCB accounts and codes, and operation types captured in your site visits? And finally, when it comes to observations, think of sample size as opportunities to observe something. As we have stressed, every time you decide on a sample size, as much as possible track the total size, the sample size, and the percentage of positive or negative indicators. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to check back for more info session videos on other Enform COR related topics.